Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on Completion by Design. This is the first in a 5-part series of programs on this topic that we'll be bringing to you over the next several months. I'm Bill Joyner of the North Carolina Community College System's Learning Solutions Center, and I'll be your host for today's session. Our guest this afternoon is Dr. Rob Johnstone. Rob is the founder and president of the National Center for Inquiry and Improvement, or NCII, which he recently created to provide professional services focusing on the use of applied inquiry to create structures and processes that achieve improved outcomes. NCII assists colleges and other organizations as they move through identifying key pain points, developing research questions, collecting and analyzing data, translating data into information, knowledge, and insight, and most importantly, the last 2 stages of transitioning from insight to strategy and action, and providing guidance through implementation. He has worked on many prominent national higher education improvement initiatives, including Completion by Design, as you might have guessed, and has provided strategic consulting, implementation strategy, and technical assistance designed to improve student completion outcomes at community colleges across the country. He has served as a director, dean, and provost in the California Community College System for over a decade, and worked as a strategic consultant in industry prior to shifting to higher education. He brings a unique dual perspective with over 20 years of consulting experience in industry and higher education, and carries an energy and passion for effecting authentic change to improve outcomes. Dr. Johnstone holds a BA in psychology from Stanford University, a master's in experimental psychology from San Jose State University, and a PhD in social psychology from the University of Oregon. I'm going to turn the program over to Rob in just a moment. But first, if you have any questions, I encourage you to ask them. You can do that at any point during the presentation by typing them into the Q&A box at the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Dr. Johnstone will address those during the presentation as he's able. For those questions that require additional time to answer, you'll be notified when we find the information you need. Now, without any further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to Rob Johnstone. It's all yours, Doctor.
Thank you, Bill. And I don't know if any of you would like to rest me, but I actually just think I'd like to hear Bill talk for the next hour because I'm getting kind of a James Earl Jones kind of vibe from Bill. And this is thank you so much for that introduction. That was something else. So yeah, you know, these webinars are always interesting. Again, hi, my name is Rob Johnstone, and I'm sitting here in a beautiful hotel room in Dayton, Ohio, where we just we're working with the Sinclair Community College, one of your CBD partner states here in Ohio, and I'm happy to be doing this here today. Webinars are always interesting to try to kind of navigate those of you who've seen me or heard me know that I like being very interactive with the audience, and webinars are a challenge for that. So I definitely want to echo Bill's advice to ask as many questions as possible in the chat, and I will try to address them all as we go through this. And we've got probably about an hour. I know it's 4 o'clock 4 o'clock for all of us, and it's the Monday before Thanksgiving. So I first want to thank you all for taking time to hear the webinar today. And without further ado, there's a lot to cover in here, so I'll go ahead and get started. So what we're going to kind of go through here today is a introduction into so one of the key concepts behind Completion by Design, the notion of the loss momentum framework. We're going to spend a little bit of time exploring some of the measures of performance in CBD. I think one of the things that's interesting about Completion by Design is really mirroring the national movement to measuring progress through students moving through various pathways through the institution. So we'll talk about that as well. So I'm going to get started here. So coming in, let's talk a little bit about, I'm going to skip the acknowledgments now. There's lots of people who've helped out on this. This is about a project funded by the Gates Foundation. We've worked with some great partners like CCRC and Public Agenda. I'm going to get to what we're going to try to do here. First, we're going to kind of go through and visualize the student experience. I want to introduce you to the loss momentum framework, and discuss kind of some of the measures of progress along the loss momentum framework, as well as CBD's key performance indicators. And then if we have time at the end, I have a couple examples of research studies that I think are pretty good examples, just as a first step on a path, thinking about how we would look at research differently when we're focusing on pathways. So let's pop in and, excuse me, talk a little bit about the student experience. So one of the things I use this slide to show is as we think about completion, and again, one thing about this presentation, by the way, is that usually each of these pieces are a much longer presentation than this, because I usually blow these out a lot and have a lot of discussion. But for now, one of the things I've taken out of this is a discussion of the completion agenda in general. We spent some time talking about the completion agenda, how it's a national movement, how it's not going away. This is not another flavor of the month thing that has come into the higher education sector. This is something that's going to stay, and it's only going to grow, the focus we have on completion. And one of the things that comes along with that is understanding what goes into completion rates. And we could chat for 2 hours about numerators and denominators of completion rates, and that could be a very involved discussion. But what we're focusing on in CBD is the completion rate for those students trying to get degrees, certificates, or transfer, and recognizing, by the way, that in community colleges we have multiple missions, and that doesn't describe all of our students. We have a number of students who are kind of drop-in students who are doing either career advancement or career retraining. We have lifelong learning students. We have community enrichment students. But for the moment, we're focusing on that group of students, which at most colleges is probably somewhere between half and 2/3 of the students who are kind of focused on these degree, certificate, and transfer pathways, and we want to focus on their completion. So one of the things I use this slide for is to show you that when we talk about completion, we often start with a number that exists at about 30,000 feet. So the idea that completion is something that we are all measuring and we're trying to improve it, and we'll hear things like, okay, well, our completion rate is 40%, we want to make it 50% in 5 years, which is all very well intentioned and good, and it's often the outcome of these planning sessions. At the end of the day, we need to break this completion down into its component parts for a number of reasons. One is because it's really hard to move a number such as a completion rate that is the amalgamation of a number of different steps, not just curricular steps by students, but also students moving through a series of stages with your institution. We're going to kind of put some framing around those stages in a second with the lost momentum framework. But if you think about this from the student standpoint just for a second, and you focus on what goes into a successful completion. So let's for a second take a look at the graphic and say we're looking at first-time students as opposed to returning students. There already are differences in how returning students move toward completion versus first-time students. Let's take that prototypical recent high school graduate first-time student group and focus on their road to completion. And kind of walk down the path. Maybe this is a student who's joined a learning community. Usually I'm focusing on the fact this is actually a successful student, by the way. So here's a first-time student who come in. They happen to join a learning community. They had some other things going on as they moved through the institution, whether it's attending a financial aid workshop. These are kind of all positive points on their path. But if you pause and really think about what a student's path looks like with your institution, it looks something more like this, right? It's a fairly chaotic, wandering path through your institution with a series of steps that for the most part are not streamlined, they're not efficient, and they're not aligned with each other. And I'm just going to kind of mouse over some of the key. This is, by the way, but one illustration of mini paths that students take through your institution. And the point here is that we over time have let this become very chaotic. We didn't intend to create pathways that were this chaotic for our students, but the net result of 50 to 60 years at most community colleges of things being developed largely in silos independent of each other is that to the student, to the recipient of our institution, the world is a very confusing place. And we've got numerous, by the way, focus group studies and student research studies that suggest that our institutions, both 2-year and 4-year, are dizzying places to navigate. And this is one of the things we try to work on in completion by design, is the idea of potentially streamlining the experiences of students and making things more predictable. A couple of things I would point out on this particular slide is, there's things on here like taking the assessment test without adequate preparation. This is one of those areas where we got a lot of research in the last 7 years. This is, by the way, a lot better than it used to be, but up until a couple of years ago, the classic story around assessment tests would go something along the lines of, a student comes in to take, to register for classes. They pop in and they tell them they have to go take the placement test. They go over waiting in line for the placement test. They take the placement test. and they're sitting in a focus group with you afterwards, and you ask them questions about what led them to that day, and you ask them when was the last time they took math, or and one of the key questions you ask them is, did someone communicate to you the importance of this event? And until recently, this was the single most predictive event of the entire ability of a student to complete college, and how long it would take. Now, you guys in North Carolina are the ultimate petri dish, by the way, for what can happen when you make state-level policy changes that suggest that the high school transcript is a better predictor of success in these placement tests. And as I've said, in every North Carolina room I've been in, and that's a lot of them in the last 2 years, I know there's a lot of both optimism and angst around this potential change, and I will say yet again in public that I think it is nearly guaranteed to lead to more students getting through, because of how it's going to reduce the number of students who have to go through long pathways, many of whom were underplaced. It is, of course, by the way, going to overplace some people. And I think that if you look at the data that suggests we had about a third of the student underplaced before, we may overplace 10 to 15% now, we're shifting the nature of the problem in a different direction, where we're going to get more students through, and then maybe from that base we can work towards getting those who may or may not have been overplaced. And you guys, I don't need to spend too much time on this, but we're working on that process. And the other thing, by the way, is we've created a system over the last 25 years in community colleges where we assume students aren't college ready and make them prove to us that they are. And I'm not sure where along the way we got to that model of, beyond a reasonable doubt proof from students that they are college ready. And I think that's something that we really need to kind of work on, and you guys are at the forefront of helping work on this nationally. And for those of you who haven't heard, Long Beach City College in California, independent of this, did a similar thing in their English department, and they found, by the way, that the overall success rate in their transfer level English course, and they had a bunch of stuff scaffolded around it, did not drop by more than 1 percentage point. They put 5 times as many students into the transfer level English course as they had the previous fall. So what data we have is suggestive that this may be a very useful move for North Carolina. I can't wait to see the data as it starts coming in. But again, the point of this slide is, and there are other individual things on this slide, the idea of students struggling to build an ed plan, choosing too many courses off their pathway, is that it is this chaotic. And if you actually track students' interactions with a college before they enter their first classroom, you will find a very random walk that looks like this. And so part of what CBD is about, and is the idea of providing some framework and some scaffolding around the student progression through this random walk that they currently are kind of experiencing with us. And so let's pop in for a second. I apologize for the coughing. I'm getting over a cold. This is killing me. Give me 1 second here. That's what I was saying. I should let Bill talk, and I don't have to worry about this. But if we go through the idea here, so the idea here is kind of simple. It's that students progress through a series of stages, and we have called them in completion by design. This is a framework that was kind of based on some of the best thinking in the field by folks like Davis Jenkins and CCRC and others. Debbie Greif and Mark Milliron at the Gates Foundation were around 3 or 4 years ago when we were thinking about this. Put together this framework to kind of cover what stages students move through. So the idea here is students move through a series of predictable stages, and we have, in this framework, called them connection, entry, progress, and completion. The idea that there's a connection phase where students are interested in the college, and actually the point up to which they apply, which really obviously deals with K-12. We'll blow each of these out in a second and explore them a little bit. There's an entry phase where they enroll and they move through the completion of their gatekeeper sources. They move then to a progress stage where they enter in a course of study and then nearly finish. And then the last stage is completing the course of study with credential and labor market value. And that last point, by the way, brings up the idea that one of the things we're trying to do in completion by design is not just increase certificates and degrees. Because faculty and folks on community college campuses, of course, know there's one real easy way to just grant more certificates and degrees, and that's the lower quality standards. And that's one of the tenets of CBD, is that we believe that the work we're doing here, the structural changes, the redesigns that are potentially available here are going to help move these numbers while keeping, or if not improving, the quality of the degrees and credentials that we give in community colleges. I'll come back to this point a little bit later, but I think that's one important, we can't say that enough as you're thinking about this completion work, is we cannot move through this completion work without making sure we maintain quality. And the idea of completion being one of a couple things. It's either a certificate that has labor market value for those going directly from our community colleges into the workforce, and for transfer students, it's transferring with junior standing in their major. That's a point Davis makes that I think is incredibly important, that transferring is one thing. transferring with junior standard in the intended major is a completely different thing. It speaks a lot to the transfer policies in the state, and I know you guys are working on that right now as we speak, and that is something that's critically important for this completion work, is for those students who do transfer, that they're not going to have to repeat a number of their units when they get to the transfer institution. This is especially important, by the way, with the recent change to the financial aid policies. And I think this is, I said this in public a lot, this is one of those features that we haven't quite understood the importance of yet. Because with students now on a ticking time clock with financial aid, where they get essentially the equivalent of 5 years of financial aid for higher education, if we in community colleges allow our time to degree to be 3.5 or 4 years, like it is at many colleges in this country, we're going to have a bunch of students transferring, and even if they had a perfect transfer articulation pathway, they'd run out of financial aid. And since they don't, and often have to repeat a lot of units, we may be very well sending a bunch of students forward when they finally do graduate who won't be able to get financial aid. And so I think this is an even stronger call to action for us to really streamline getting more students through and getting them through more quickly. So this loss momentum framework, and the idea that at the bottom of this, there are policies, practices, programs, and processes that underlie the framework. You know, this isn't rocket science, but I think what's important about the framework is if you think historically about how we've managed the students' involvement with the college, it is, with a few exceptions, and most of those exceptions are in cohort-based CTE programs, our unit of measure for a student has been the course. Essentially, the college existed to offer courses. They hired faculty to teach courses. Students registered to take courses. And I think one of the things that the shift towards completion is talking about is not a focus on any one course, but the shift to the idea of a program, a degree, or a certificate, or a program of study. Any of these two terms we use to talk about the overall pathway of a student, not about any one course. You know, there's one of my colleagues from California, Myra Snell, in discussing the developmental math sequence, pointed out that, you know, if you have an 80% success rate, a 60% success rate in a course and a 90% retention rate, if you put 4 courses in a row with a 60% success rate and a 90% retention rate, you're going to end up with about 10 or 15% of the students getting through mathematically. And we've essentially, that kind of illustrates the model we put in front of students. We've looked at courses before, and when we look at course success rates, we miss overall trends towards students progressing towards a degree. And that's something that we really try to focus on with the loss momentum program. I think it's really helpful for all of us to think about students progressing in this way. So let's for a second pop in. Any questions at this point? I want to pause. I think after everyone kind of quieted down after we got the music stopped, so I think the events. But if you have questions, fire them in there. And as we move on to the next step, so let's talk about some loss points. So the idea here behind the loss and momentum framework, shockingly, given that it's called the loss and momentum framework, is that we have a number of points we can identify that are potential loss points for students, and then some things we can identify that could help them establish momentum to moving them forward towards the degrees at higher rates and at quicker rates. So what we've done in the next 2 slides is summarize, based on the national research by folks like CCRC, like WestEd, like MDRC, like a lot of the research universities that have looked at some of the known points that we know our students struggle with. We've listed a bunch of them on this slide I'm going to show you. You guys, by the way, may at your colleges have other ones. And that's one of the things I do when we have more time in person, is have colleges get together and strategize for key segments of the students. So maybe it's for recent high school students who test 1 level below in both subjects. What are their loss points that you know, based on what you know about your student population? That's one of the tenets of CBD, is creating the time and space to have those discussions with your colleagues. And so I would encourage you, it's hard on a webinar to do this, but not to just accept these at face value, but to really explore how they interact with what you know about your students. And you also can collect data on your students to find out where some of their loss and momentum points are. I think one of the really fascinating opportunities we have going forward is we get more systems, data systems that help us kind of establish where students are on their pathway towards a degree. And I'll tell you about a couple of examples of this when we get to the momentum points, is to kind of start monitoring what are the key courses and the key outcomes that we can use to predict when students aren't likely to succeed, and then we can intervene. And so I'll give some outcomes of this in a second. Let's talk about the loss points first. So some loss points at connection. So these are the classic ones. This is now up front. At the connection stage, so a couple of them, students not applying to college, students delaying entry. This third one about college counseling patterns. This is not to say that college counselors aren't doing a great job, but as most of you know, we don't have, whether you call them counselors or advisors, we don't have enough people to serve this function. Most of our students who enter, if they're lucky, get a 30-minute counseling session, and potentially some orientation and advising, but it's very loose up front what students are getting. And one of the other things about those upfront advisors, it's really challenging for those folks to have to help students navigate the relative kind of morass of the number of degrees and programs we have, which are highly unstructured. We're going to come back to this point in entry, but this, most of your college catalogs, I'm sure, if they're like ours, have between 80 and 150 programs and over 1,000 courses. And the idea, and one of the things I'm fond of saying is, ask yourself what the only single piece of documentation you give students to help them make a decision about programs. And it's the catalog, the college catalog, whether it's online or not, because not all students get to advising. And so for many of them, what they have is the catalog. And as I urge you to open the catalog to the pages that list all 130 of your programs, and it'll end up being a couple hundred pages. And ask yourself how useful that is for helping students make a decision about what's the most appropriate major for them. We've really historically left this up to the student to navigate our systems rather than provided them with any structure or information to help make these choices. And so, on the other, just even if we had, by the way, a couple of hours for each student up front with an advisor, none of those advisors, for the most part, have worked in the field that they are advising students into. So we have another issue there, which is, if I'm an advisor and someone asks me, what it's like to be an accountant versus a phlebotomist. I have not been an accountant or a phlebotomist, and I have a really hard time helping folks see the difference between those two fields, and it's a challenge for advisors to serve those. And one of my favorite stories, one of the colleges in Texas we work with, had all the faculty come to campus the day before fall classes opened, and this is not unusual that faculty come to campus the day before the fall classes open. What they did, though, is they had the faculty sit in their offices and talk to any student who came through the door about what it was like to be in their field. Not actually even doing advising, but just telling them what it was like to be in their field. And this idea of connecting college to the real world and college to careers was something I thought was a really neat idea. Just to remind, one thing I've become fond of saying is exactly 99.9% of our students are career technical focused. We have this somewhat hollow distinction between GE transfer and career tech programs, or even AA and AS programs. And I remind you that maybe one or two of our students are here for the love of learning. They're all here to get a better job or career at some point. Some of them are here for 1 or 2 classes, and they're getting career advancement, career training right now. Some of them are in 1-year certificate, 2-year certificate programs, which lead directly to jobs. But even the folks who are transferring are in this because somewhere down the line they have the expectation of a better job and a better career. And so I think there's a lot to be said for tying students into these more career service ideas early on and structuring that, and not leaving that to chance or to a reading of the catalog or to 20 minutes that they happen to get to be with an advisor. So at entry, a couple of the other things, and whenever Davis, and I was just with Davis today here in Ohio, whenever Davis Jenkins and I do this set of slides, his most important single bullet is this first one under entry, which is unstructured programs and too many choices. And the point being here that we have so many degrees and majors that it is really hard for students to navigate them. And even with the 100 and some odd degrees or 80 to 120 degrees most of our colleges have, there's not a lot of structure to most of them. And so the idea, and this is a lot of behavioral psychology and social psychology, as well as behavioral economics literature. We got a lot of information about what happens to people when they're faced with too many choices. The main answer is they get paralyzed. One of my best examples of this is for those of you who've been to the Cheesecake Factory and know that when you see the 500 items on the Cheesecake Factory menu, it's almost impossible to decide what you want for dinner. And what people end up doing, what the research has shown, they end up picking the same 5 things they could have ordered at Applebee's. So we are paralyzed by choice. We often fall into the trap of blaming our students for the problems about students not getting through. And while students certainly have a lot to do with it, we create the structures and systems they're forced to navigate. And as it is now, they are navigating a system that has way too many choices on the program and degree side, especially since many of those choices, by the way, haven't had people graduate them in them in years. If you have 85 programs, I'm guessing the top 6 or 7 cover 75% of your graduates. And so, this idea of structure is one of the critical pieces of completion by design. And I think it's also a critical piece as we think about getting more students through. And this is not just a completion by design thing, by the way. when you look at, and this is one of the reasons CBD has this as such a clear feature, when you look at the four-year schools who have really transformed their completion rates, and I think the two best examples that come up are Florida State and Georgia State. When you look at these two colleges, in Florida State, who was able to improve their graduation rate by 10 points, which is a lot, and Georgia State, who took theirs from 32% to 53%. You know, they all did a number of things, but one of the huge things they did is they actually added a lot of structure to the programs. At both Florida State and Georgia State, and these are large R1, Research 1 institutions. Arizona State doing the same thing, really tying things into a much higher level of structure to navigate all of their degree programs. Austin P does it as well in Tennessee, and so this is a big tenet of completion by design, the idea of structure, and we know how controversial it is. I'm guaranteeing you the things that are going through your head now as you think about structure. We've heard before, and I would not in any way minimize how compelling of an argument they are or how compelling of a challenge they present. But I think at the end of the day, one of the things that we're working towards is the idea that if you do look at the places in higher education where there is structure, you know, and the cohort-based CTE programs are a great example. Yes, nursing is probably not a great example because they have entrance requirements. There's lots of cohort-based CTE programs that have 80 and 90% success rates, and the students going into them are no more qualified or less qualified than the ones who enter our AA and GE programs. And so one of the things to note here is there are other differences there, such as students being motivated and students being committed to something and knowing they're going to get a job on the other end, which of course I pause and say those aren't those things we want to try to do for all of our students, is motivate them and get them committed to something and working towards a career on the other end of this. So I think this idea of structure is probably the most controversial piece within CBD. I also think it's one of the most important. I'm not going to go through all of these specifically. I'll stop on the lost points to talk about another one, the third bullet under progress there that I think is my personal, whether it's platform or pet peeve, is that this idea that progress isn't monitored and feedback not given. And so, you know, one of the things that I say about this is if you ask yourself, what are the only times you communicate to your students about their progress towards a degree or a certificate? And for most of our students, the only time we actually do that, one answer you'll hear is grades, which I would draw a small distinction there, that isn't actually progress towards the degree that we're communicating grades, it's how you did in a single course. You could pass 100 courses in an institution and not make much progress toward a degree because either they're not degree applicable or they're not they don't move together to form a career, a pathway, a program pathway. But we communicate to students when they graduate, and we communicate to students when they're on if they go on academic probation. Aside from that, we do almost nothing to communicate to students about how they're doing. And it really doesn't have to be this way. And if you look at what industry does on this front, this is where in the late 90s is the data explosion that happened in industry that we're really dealing with 10 years later now in higher ed. The companies that figured this out, the Amazons of the world, the Apples of the world, figured out how to use the information they had about their customers to strengthen their relationship with them. And you know, in the industry world, it was to offer them things they wanted. And it actually, and from the company side, it strongly increased their lifetime value as a customer. And for us, you know, we're not dealing in economic terms there, but we do have an enormous amount of information about our students. They come in, they fill out an application at the start, they interact with our student services in various ways, but then they start taking courses, and they start potentially making progress towards something, and we don't use any of that information to customize our support. And I'll give you an example of this in one of the studies we'll get to in a little bit of a while. So I think this is one that we really can change and learn from what industry does. And then on the completion side, you know, the idea that at the end we have a lot of students transferring without a credential, and there's a huge debate about whether that's a good or bad idea. The second one, as I mentioned, has become incredibly important, this idea that students accumulate credits and debt that aren't aligned with completion. And so as the financial aid regs changed to only allow 5 years of financial aid, as well as the idea that students have been coming to us racking up student debt and not completing. And we are very fond of hammering the for-profits for this issue, and we are certainly on average better than the for-profits in terms, most for-profits in terms of this issue of running up student debt and not resulting in completion. But this is still a huge issue for us. We've got lots of students taking classes, and they're not aligned with completion. And I do know, by the way, that there's a discussion that comes around this about how many students are gaming the system to get financial aid. And I'm sure that is occurring at some schools more than others, but I also would ask how often that's actually occurring. I'm sure that is happening on every college campus in this country. The question is it happening, 20 times out of 100, 50 times out of 100, or 1 time out of 100? My guess is the number's closer to 3 to 5 times out of 100. So this issue that we run into here about students gaming the system for financial aid, I think is something we have to ask ourselves, how often is this actually? When it does happen, it's very memorable. So we kind of run into the availability heuristic on this one. But the question I ask on that one is, how often does it actually happen? But this idea of accumulating credits without completion is clearly an issue we have to wrestle with. So let's talk about some of the momentum points for a second. So the idea that if we want to help students along the path towards the degree, what are some things we can do? So let's start at connection. Fostering college-going norms in high school, things like dual enrollment. By the way, I have yet to see a dual enrollment program in this country that doesn't work at a much higher completion rate than those of other entering freshmen. Entering first-time students. And it's not to say that we should do more. We should vastly expand the size of our dual enrollment programs. If we did that, by the way, you get a lot more completion. And I know it's a unique type of high school student that will enroll in a dual enrollment program, but partially that could be about how we market these things. The bottom line, I'll talk about ed planning in high school for a second. We're very fond of saying students change their mind 150 times, so we can't do higher levels of structure. I think there's a really interesting example that comes from Santa Barbara in California, one of the co-winners of the Aspen Prize, which I also work on site visits for. In Santa Barbara, it has this program. It's oh man, I'm forgetting the name of it at the moment, but they take all 9th graders in their local public high school district, and they are all required to fill out a 10-year educational plan. And they do this as part of a class time, and it's a requirement to get out of the 9th grade. And each year in the 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, they update this educational plan with their current thinking and their current feelings. And it's a really interesting idea of going back into the high schools and starting this process. And one of the folks from Santa Barbara who we talked about this said, we know they're going to change their mind 6 or 7 times, but at least they're getting the information in a structured way. I think this is such a critical piece. And we talked earlier about the idea of even just knowing about the programs and trying to navigate them is such a challenge. And what these guys are trying to do is really kind of bring that back into the high schools. At the top of the connection, these momentum strategies on fostering college-going norms, expanding awareness of programs. Some of our less enrolled programs may partially be less enrolled because we don't do a good job of selling them to folks. Everyone wants to be a nurse, but we have lots of great allied health programs and other programs that produce people who get jobs at fairly high wages and don't have the entrance requirements in nursing. And I also throw in there that for those of you who have nursing programs, ask yourself how many pre-nursing students you have who are never going to get into this nursing program. It's a numbers game. If you have 50 slots a year in a nursing program, you may have as many as 1,000 or 1,500 students who are quote unquote pre-nursing. And so 1,450 of those students in any given year are going to be wondering what they're going to do when they don't get into the nursing program. So another idea of expanding the awareness of these programs is pretty important. So entry, some of the key things in entry, this first one, mandatory intrusive advising. So this has been a really interesting one that some of our CBD colleges have worked on and others around the country, the idea of mandatory advising up front. We also talk about things like, mandatory orientation. And one of the things that I try to talk about some is that we need to make sure that these things like mandatory orientation and mandatory advising are not the only thing we do with students. Like, it is great to streamline the upfront process, the onboarding process, if you will, the intake process with students. But we also have to try to make sure that we avoid thinking that students will get everything they need in the 2 weeks before school when we give them orientation and advising, and everything will be hunky-dory for the 2.5 to 4 years after that. I did just use hunky-dory, a nice 60s reference, dating myself well past my years. But everything is not going to flow easily from what happens in those first 2 weeks before they really even know what college is like for many of them. So I think mandatory orientation, mandatory advising are incredibly important, but we also need to think about how our support structures continue what we put up in front of folks at the first stage. And so this idea of mandatory intrusive advising being ongoing is critical. One of the other co-winners of the Aspen Prize this year was Walla Walla in Washington. And this is a college who's taken this, they have a great data system. They have something called an advisor data portal where all students can see their progress towards the degree, as well as advisors at any given time. But they also require all students to meet with an advisor every semester to get a registration code to register for the next semester. They've decided that this is worth the effort of the faculty, and it keeps people kind of on the idea that advising is an ongoing thing. It doesn't happen once. And so that's something that I think is an interesting idea, if, maybe not the easiest one to implement at a lot of our schools. The idea of accelerating entry into programs of study, getting students into programs earlier. Gretchen Schmidt and Davis and I were chatting about this today. Very few students almost no student comes to us to major in dev ed, right? They're here to do something else, and one of the things we need to kind of wrestle with is how do we get them through dev ed into the transfer level courses at a higher rate. And obviously in North Carolina that's changing in these next couple of years, where you'll have significantly more students starting in transfer level courses, but then the idea of getting them into a program earlier, even if they're starting at transfer level, the idea that they can make progress towards something more quickly, even if they're deciding. And again, we're going to have lots of students who are undecided. We know that. So the question is, what do we do with undecided students? And right now what we do is we just let them wander around the curriculum without any support, trying to help them make the decisions that could really get them on a pathway moving forward. And so when you look at what some colleges have done on this, like Arizona State and some of the schools in Florida State, undecideds go through a very structured process to help them decide. They take a certain type of courses in their first semester, and by the end of the first year, they're focused on making this decision. And I think we could learn a lot from the structures that we see in some of these four-year schools, as well as folks like Miami-Dade who are wrestling with this in the community college world. Some other momentum strategies here on the progress side, incentivizing attendance. And so my big one here, again, I mentioned earlier, that progress to completion is monitored and feedback given. We're here, it's a couple days before Thanksgiving, and all of you who are representing colleges had a bunch of students start this fall who are first time in college students you never had before. Let's just say, for example, there's 1,000 of those students coming into your college in any given fall semester. And they're about to finish their first semester with you. And if you're like most of us, and again, I used to be a provost and I can speak to 2 colleges where I used to work, you and we will do absolutely nothing to them to communicate to them about how that first semester went, whether they made progress, what they can do differently, what we know about them based on what they did in those semesters. And you easily could think of a world where we wrote some business rules that covered maybe the 6 or 8 most common situations for students going through their first semester. And so, just a group who came in, took 12 or more units, got a 3.5, passed all their courses, you might think of targeting with one type of message. And another group who maybe came in and took 12, only passed 6, and was with a 2.2 GPA, you might think of saying, hey, we saw you had your first experience with us, and we saw it was a little challenging for you. Here's what we have to help. Here's how we can help you going forward, or come on in and talk to us. One of the things we're trying to do with these strategies is not require the student to be the one to raise their hand when they have any help, when they're running into problems. And we know from the research from CCRC and others, if you study who actually uses student services at most of our colleges where it's not mandatory or structured, we are amazing at helping B+ students become A- students and A- students become A students. We have basically in our systems unintentionally set up a system where those who think to raise their hand are the ones who get the services, and for the most part, those are the students who already are going to succeed. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is, what's the safety net for students struggling? And one question to ask yourself and your colleagues is, does anyone at your campus know when a student drops out? Whether it's a first semester or a second semester or a fourth semester student. The usual answer to that at most colleges is the only people who know are the cohort-based CTU programs. They absolutely know. But for most of us, for random gen ed students, that's a really small college. We don't know when students drop out. They can come in, they can take courses, they can drop. We don't know much about it. And so part of what we're trying to do is change that relationship so that, for example, we know how many students we're trying to become who are on the accounting pathway and what percentage of them made it past milestones 1, 2, and 3 on that path. Other things on kind of progress towards completion of being monitored. What about celebrating progress? The idea that you got a bunch of students in this fall semester who are going to pass through some thresholds. Some of them may get halfway toward their degree. Some of them may get 3/4. Why not call that out and celebrate it? And heck, get really slick. Tell them what they have left to do in case they don't know. There's all kinds of things we could do with this. Think about what Amazon does with information. Think about what iTunes does, or Pandora, or any of the websites that and companies you're used to working with. Our students are used to those type of environments in which they are interacting with organizations, and what their behavior is being used to customize their experience. And this is, I think, part of what we're trying to move towards is using the data we have. And this is not creating new systems. You have a lot of folks. You already have a lot of people coming in that you could identify who are finishing this first semester, by the way, or passing through these thresholds that we might be able to use this information. And then the final one on completion is just some ideas here on, you know, the fact that we continue to do advising. We actually have incentives to transfer with credentials, removing some barriers to graduation. You know, the idea that if we have a bunch of extra things in our graduation requirements, trying to get them out of the way so we can get students with credentials. And so as you move forward, again, the idea behind these loss of momentum strategies is that these are what we've seen in the field based on the research are some things that either hinder or help students. And one question to ask yourself, and we don't have time to discussing is a challenge in a webinar, but you can discuss with your colleagues, which is how can you go back and look at what you do at Connection, look at what you do at Entry, look at what you do at Progress or at Completion, and focus on the things that students are having challenges with and the things you might be able to do to help them. And in a subsequent webinar, we'll talk about the CBD design principles, which are really based on this on the loss momentum framework. So again, I want to pause. Anyone have any chat questions about anything they just heard from the loss momentum framework? I'm going to pause uncomfortably for 30 seconds here in case give you guys time to type. It's almost happy hour time. Come on, someone fire in a question. I'll force Ed or Laura to ask a question soon if you guys don't. So, any questions about this? People just hoping he'll keep going. All right, we'll do that then. So let's talk a little bit about how do you measure progress. So this idea that we're focusing on students, we're focusing on a different way of looking at students. We're not keeping the course as the unit of measure. We're really starting to try to focus on their progress towards a degree or their progress towards a certificate, the momentum along the pathway. So one of the things we did in Completion by Design is ask ourselves, how will we know when they're successful? You know, one way, obviously, you know that they're successful is when what percentage of them actually complete certificates, degrees. All right, I've got a taker on the question here. Oh, and then I closed it. Hold on one second. When you communicate with students, do you do so through mail, email, or phone? What's been most successful? Great question, Cheryl. And I think this is a really challenging one because, as we know, I think a lot of us have heard now as we move to some of these national connections that students aren't using email anymore. They're not even really using Facebook. I think part of this is a little bit of a red herring. You know, if there is value in a communication stream, and this is, I think, the reason that students don't respond to a lot of the communication streams we have with them, is we haven't actually given them a lot of value in it. You know, I think most of the structures we've seen, Cheryl, have been email that have really kind of focused on that. But when you look at, let me go with Walla Walla wouldn't be an exception to that. They have their model, which is based on really monitoring the student progress forward. They use personal contact and phone also to contact students who fall out into these areas where an alert system catches them, and they tried multiple ways to contact them. I think mail is probably going to be the least effective. Finding our students is really difficult. They're a transitory population sometimes. I think the combination of email or phone, and I defer to those who know more about the social media angle. I go to conferences and I hear about what folks have done with social media, but I don't know how much I've seen it used in this kind of, you know, safety net structure. So I think I would say most likely, and obviously there's a cost side to this too, right? You know, we can't, there's a reason we don't do 2-hour-long advising sessions with everyone, is we don't have enough advisors. So part of this is about providing some of these structures in automated ways and clearing the decks for the more intense one-on-one interactions with folks downstream. So I think the easy answer is what I have seen most is email, but I have seen some folks who will phone, where the phone has worked as well. I think a lot of that depends on kind of your population of students as well. All right, so moving on, let's go kind of talking in CBD, like we were getting into what do we use to measure progress. And so I'm going to share with you just real quickly kind of some of the KPIs we use in Completion by Design. And KPI stands for Key Performance Indicator. Let's skip this. And so what we did in this process, and this was mainly the Gates Foundation, CCRC, and others, looking at measures of progress. And we know, you look nationally, we have the Voluntary Framework for Accountability. We have all kinds of accountability measures. You have your own accountability measures within North Carolina. And the key for us with this was to look at which ones were kind of focused on the more longitudinal nature, the idea that this is something unfolding over time. And again, knowing that if we measure completion rates, and by the way, this is something we wrestle with in completion by design, we measure 5-year completion rates, which is you always can debate about whether it should be 3-year, 5-year, 7-year, and at some point you just have to draw a line in the sand. But when you measure 5-year completion rates, and we make changes, for example, in some of these CBD colleges, which let's say go into effect in fall of 2013, it is spring of 2018 when you get your first feedback on completion rates for that group. And so that's too long of a period of time to wait. So we've tried within CBD to have a number of metrics that vary over 1 year, 2 year, and we've even added some 1-semester KPIs. So let's just pop into a couple of these, and we've matched them to the stages of the loss momentum framework. So just to introduce these, at the entry stage, so we're trying to manage these 3 things. So what we did in CBD is we established baselines on all of this with data across the colleges. And then, of course, the main goal for this is to set them as benchmarks for what we can improve. And there was a very detailed process within CBD of matching up the strategies, the implementation strategies folks had to how they were going to potentially move these key performance indicators. But just to get a sense of the type of things we're measuring, the percentage of students coming from high school that place below college level, well, I don't need to tell you guys, this number is going to change pretty significantly in North Carolina in the next 3 years, given the policy changes on placement at the state level. The idea behind this one being in there was we've made it increasingly harder until recently for students to get into transfer level courses. And B, there's also the issue of working with the high schools to try to help reduce this number that we're measuring in CBD. And then the second 2 are kind of the clear ones, for better or for worse. And I would argue offline for anyone who wants to have the conversation that it's far from the worst. We have let our 2 measures of college readiness be how students are prepared in math and English. And prepared in math and English by a pretty narrow definition of what mathematical quantitative reasoning skills students use and/or writing and communication skills that students use. But I have some data which I probably won't get to on this call that suggests that while math and English work really well as proxies for college readiness, it is not necessarily math and English per se that is actually related to success in transfer level courses. It's what they may represent in other areas. But we are measuring here the percentage of students who complete remediation within 1 year. So if what percentage of your students referred to DEB Ed actually complete DEB Ed within 1 year? And by the way, at most colleges, this number is very low. It hovers in the teens and even in single digits at some colleges. If you have a lot of students testing, if you have students testing 2 levels below, 3 levels below, it's impossible for them to get through in a year. And 2 levels below, it's very challenging. They'd have to get through in each of their first 2 semesters, which doesn't happen very often. And so, we have these 2 measures here, which is kind of the success of students who are starting pre-college. And I think for North Carolina, again, all 3 of these metrics, one of the things about initiatives like CBD is they're not independent of everything else going on. And the policy changes in North Carolina have been obviously large. And this particularly what you guys have done in the DEB Ed, and it's not just on the placement side, but you're also working on the kind of the modularization as well as and the redesign of the curriculum and things like Statway and Quantway and other acceleration models. Like you guys are really, you're wrestling with a lot of stuff here on the DEB Ed side. But these numbers will all change pretty markedly in North Carolina in the next couple of years. So let's move on to some of the other ones. And this is the second one was trying to get at, is there anything we can look at in 1 semester that can help measure progress? And so what we landed on here was the first one, the percentage of students who get 6 or more transfer level units in their first semester. So obviously, you have that full-time and part-time students tracking. You probably want to track those differently. But let's say we look at all full-time students. What percentage of them accumulate 6 or more transfer units in their first semester? Pretty useful metric of initial progress. A second one is just the percentage of courses that students complete. So this, if you look at if students take 4 courses, what percentage of them they pass with a C or better? And then the classic persistence rate from first to second semester. So again, all of these are trying to capture progress forward, momentum forward in some way, even within the first semester. And we know that that first semester is only an indicator of what's going to happen on a longer pathway, but we think it's a pretty useful first step. And then some of the KPIs at the progress stage, with the classic fall-to-fall persistence number. This is one I'm not a huge fan of because for the most part, historically hasn't moved very much, and it may be the case that it moves going forward as we make big structural changes, but I think it's a challenge to really move this number. But I love the next couple. The idea, the percentage of students earning 12 college credits in 1 year, 24 and 2. 12 credits, college transfer, college level credits in 1 year is not very many. And if we have, what percentage of our full-time students are hitting that? And again, it's a number that's not very high. And I think it's incredibly predictive of an overall graduation rate, by the way, both of these numbers, as well as the percentage of students who enter a program of study or concentrate within 1 or 2 years. It's going to be a little tricky to operationalize. What does it mean to concentrate? I think we settled on a definition within CBD that deals with CIP codes and students taking 9 or more units within a CIP code or concentrators. This is so challenging because our programs are so unstructured. It's often really hard to even tell what student a program's in right now. Pick a random student out of your, you want to have a fun sometime, go pick out 10 transcripts of students who have between 30 and 45 units at your campus and try to figure out what program they're in. It'll probably be pretty clear for a couple of them, but for some of them you won't have any ability to figure out what they're trying to do because it is that random and that unstructured right now. And then the last one, KPIs at completion stage. This first one is kind of the, I refer to it as the Uber or the super KPI, because this at the end of the day, this is why we're here. We're here to try to get more students to get a positive outcome. And what that means is degree, certificate, transfer without a degree, a bachelor's degree, any of the kind of big positive outcomes here. And this is what, at the end of the day, we're trying to really move the needle on. So all the other KPIs roll up into this one, so I think it's really useful to look at this number. The challenge with this number, of course, as I said, is, for fall 2013 changes, we'll first get information on this in spring of 18, which is why we have all these other KPIs. In the perfect world, this is the ultimate KPI that you would have, but we want to have be able to measure progress on these other ones. And these second two deal with the issue of excess credits. I think the kind of percentage of students you're earning excess credits is not one of my favorites either, simply because unless the student hits the number exactly, they are all earning excess credits. I don't know about you, but I think about 2% of our students actually hit the number exactly. So we have to kind of operationalize but the idea behind here is solid, is we don't want students graduating from a 60-unit degree with 75 or 90 units. And there are places in this country where there's an average number in the 20s of excess credit. From what I remember, the North Carolina colleges didn't have as big of an issue with this one. So I think what you can see from these KPIs, and the reason I introduced them here, is that the measurement of progress, and you guys are involved in statewide completion efforts, you're involved in local completion efforts, the measure of progress toward these things, the metrics we use need to reflect kind of this momentum toward these kind of outcomes, such as certificates and degrees. And so I'm noting that it's 5 o'clock. And here's a slide that we summarize things in. And I'm questioning how many of you are going to be that willing to say, I'm looking at Laura's question here. Question from Laura, too slow on the uptake. Some questions from someone, which I think may be Laura, to me. How do you recommend sharing KPI data with others across our colleges? This is a great question from Laura Couturier from Jobs for the Future. The idea of this KPI data we're working at, how do we share these with our colleges? I think the key here, as we think about the data, the KPI data, is the notion of creating time and space to really explore. Too often what happens, especially with metrics that can be viewed as accountability metrics, is we kind of throw them at people without giving people time to really explore what goes into them, what constitutes the numbers, and how they represent what we know about the colleges, and we try to improve them going forward. And so I think that the idea with the KPI data is really what we did in CBD is we got folks together in a room for a couple of hours and said, hey, let's take a look at your data and let's see what, see if anything that strikes you here, is there anything that's particularly surprising to you, and actually, talk it through with your folks, and not just senior leaders, but with a team of cross-functional folks. We found that really useful in completion by design. And so I think it can be really helpful. And then one of the questions is, and this is one for your state folks, how many of these KPIs will be available at a state level? And I think it's an interesting question. I don't control that kind of process, but I think the idea of some of these key ones being used in this slide here, which, by the way, I'll provide you this presentation afterwards, kind of summarizes them all in one place. And I really think, if you ask me, obviously the students completing your transfer in 5, 4, 3 years is incredibly important, but looking at some of those metrics such as earning 12 college credits in 1 year and 24 in 2 years, are really important early predictors of success. So let's step on here. And this set of slides coming after this, and I don't think I'm going to have time to go through too much of this. I'm just going to pick one, and if people need to drop off, they can. The question comes up is, what kind of, so if you're going to use the loss momentum framework to think about how students progress through our college and analyze places where people run into loss points or may not experience momentum points, and you're going to kind of monitor this with progress of the KPIs, what are the types of research questions you can ask to help move this forward? And I think there's a huge number of research questions. And I think what I wanted to show you today, just real quickly, were some examples of the types of questions that I think can be useful. You know, one of them that I don't have here is, as you start getting more and more data and you have more structure in your pathways, one of the questions you can ask is, where are students struggling? Like I saw Georgia State is one of my favorite examples of this, has really done a lot of work on structured the pathway. They've also identified over 700 markers for success scaffolded to their 40 programs. That is, each program identified a number of markers for success. And one of the ones I remember is that in their poli-sci department, there was this one course where if students took this course and got an A or a B, they had an over 70% chance of graduating. You know, if they got a C, it was under 25%. So one of the things to kind of focus on in these pathway analyses is what are the courses that are incredibly good predictors of whether students are going to make progress and complete, or they're going to be at significant risk for not completing. And so I think that's, those are one level of research question. And I'll show you one of these. This comes from a larger presentation, and you can take a look at the other one afterwards. Skipping this. I'm going to skip a couple of these in the interest of time. This talks about the idea of the applied inquiry framework, which we developed for CBD. What this really gets at is, and I'll go pause on this slide briefly. We've done a really good job historically at gathering evidence in the last 10 years. You know, the idea of a culture of evidence has been a phrase that's kind of come into the mainstream in the last 5 to 7 years. Which, by the way, is literally 10 years after it started happening in industry. And one of the things that's happened in the last 5 to 7 years is we've done a great job at collecting data. We've gathered a lot of evidence, but for the most part, not a lot of colleges feel like they've gotten a lot of insight out of that evidence and actually done anything with it. And so that's there's a number of reasons for this. But one of the things that we talk about, and there's a whole inquiry guide I can point you on this, is this idea that we need to situate the evidence we're gathering in a larger process of inquiry. So the idea here is that there's a series of predictable stages. One is you have to actually explore how to improve outcomes. 2, you have to gather meaningful evidence, and that's the big difference between gathering meaningful evidence and actually just gathering evidence. Stage 3, discussing it broadly. This is the one I think we have the most issue with. If you ask the folks in CBD, the single thing that the money that CBD had gave them, remember, none of the money in CBD was operational. What it did give them was the opportunity to have time and space to get groups together to really explore this data. And I think that's one of the things we can learn from. I've worked at, obviously, a number of colleges that didn't have initiatives like this, and I've seen it where colleges create this time and space to explore the data. It really is a critical piece of this process. But again, I'm going to show you one example of this study and then wrap up here. We got to make sure we're focusing on the right data. So the next slide I'm going to show you, which I clicked forward to quickly, and I gave away the punchline, is, this is a 20-year trend for California community college. Let's look at the course success rate. So you look at what's happened in the last 20 years in California, and essentially the course success rates did not change over a 20-year period. And so, we can get into a long discussion about whether that's a good or a bad thing. But the bottom line is, when you look at the big question it should cause us to ask is, how useful is that metric in setting institutional strategies? And again, until recently, it was the type of metric we used, was focused on things more like course success rate. And other things here, like when we look at things like a learning community and say, how effective is a learning community? We tend to do things like, all right, well, we'll give the learning community folks a year. We'll give them a group of 30 to 50 students. We'll see how it goes. And maybe we find after the year that, it improved things by about 2 percentage points, but then these things cost money and they take a lot of effort, so maybe this isn't all that useful. When in fact, the real, when you really think about evaluating the learning community, to those people on the ground, it's quite different. The world to them looks more like this. The world of the learning community is actually an amalgamation of about 12 things, and this is just an example, by the way, that are going on beneath the surface, whether it's sequencing the course material, counseling, coordination, classroom technology, lesson plan, timeliness. The point to the folks in the learning community is they may be doing really well at some of this, not very well at others, but we lose that when we analyze things back at this level, up at the top level, and say, it's 77 versus 75. We miss out on an opportunity to actually improve things that may have been going on by taking some of these blue and yellow dots and turning them into maroon ones where things are working better. So I'm just going to briefly introduce these three studies. I'm going to show you one of them real quickly. And these are three studies I use. They're not certainly the only three studies you could use to start a campus conversation about student success. In fact, I think if I were to start today, I would start with what I mentioned a couple minutes ago, the idea of trying to identify courses that are barriers for students and are very predictive of what happens downstream, and try to both change that before they have the struggles in those courses, but also when they do have struggles in those courses, intervene to try to provide a support structure to help them deal with those changes. But these are three I've used. I've used these for about 10 years. I find them really useful to kind of change conversations. First is grades and success in sequence course. This is the one I'll show you now, actually. Actually, no, I'm going to show you the third one, levels of preparedness in GE courses. The second one's cohort tracking in Dev Ed. You guys probably know a lot of that data. And this final one, I'm going to show you levels of preparedness in math and English courses. I'll just introduce this real quickly because I like this as a way to frame the discussion. I'm hopping forward here. This is the other set of really cool slides you're missing, so be sure to ask me about this later. All right, so this is a study that what I'm doing here is this is the classic question of how do students do in GE courses based on English and math preparedness. So this tends to get brought forward in the classic prerequisite discussion, right? Do we need a prerequisite on, I'll use my old course, Psych 100, Psych 1, General Psychology, based on usually what we're talking about is English level. So one of the questions we asked about that is, well, if we don't have prerequisites right now, we got a bunch of students in that Psych course who are in English courses. I know what level of English they're at. I want to see how they do in the Psych course. So what we tend to do are things like this, which is we look at, all right, so this side of the graph over here is showing you that in any given semester, I got a bunch of students taking an English course and a bunch who aren't. This is the group in the blue over here is kind of a control group. And on the right side, we're kind of interested in how do these students do. There aren't many, by the way, students 2 below at this college who take this course, but how do these students do when they get into Psych 100 or Psych 101? And what you find is, interestingly, probably what you would expect, which is students who are up here at the kind of transfer A, transfer B levels are about 68, 75%. They do really well. Students who are 1 below, it drops to 48, 2 below, it drops to 31%. So we sit there and say, well, you know, I think obviously what we need here is we need some sort of prerequisite for Psych 1 of maybe eligibility for transfer level English. And so one of the things that was really interesting, the first time I presented this, I was sitting in a room at my old college, and the person who asked this question was the lowest paid person in the room, was a financial aid tech sitting in the back. And I had the next slide ready, and I would have planted it if she hadn't asked the question. But she said, well, Rob, that's really interesting, but what about math and Psych 101? How well does math predict Psych 101? I said, good question. Well, let's show you how well math predicts Psych 101. See if this looks familiar. It's almost exactly the same. I know this is 1 transfer level course and 3 pre-transfer, but math is almost equally predictive of Psych 101 as is English. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, why is that? Why is math is equally predictive of Psych 101? And this is one where I usually stop and do about 15 minutes of conversation, but I can tell you the reasons we hear for this. And I don't have the answer of why this is, by the way. I just think it's very interesting that both math and English are equally predictive of Psych 101. And the main thing you kind of center around, well, there's life events, there's non-cognitive things like motivation, confidence, social capital, productive persistence. You know, it could be that math and English are related. The IR folks in the room will say this is a survival analysis, and the people who actually survive our Dev Ed sequences are going to do really well in other courses. I think it's incredibly poignant that math is equally predictive of English of the success. And just to show that it's not just Psych 1, I did this for 10 GE courses at this college, just to kind of show you the overall trends. You see roughly the same progression in each of them. You know, and by the way, the green bars have small sample sizes in some of them. You see the same overall progression in other courses like speech, econ, history, health science. And then you look at this slide. This is where I usually pause and hang out for a second and ask people what's really interesting about this slide. And the answer to me of what's interesting about this slide is this course right here, Fitness 334, which is a Northern California fitness course, and you can kind of play in your head the Northern California stereotype game and ask yourself what fitness course this might be, and usually the two answers I get are surfing and yoga, and it turns out this is yoga. And what you see here is nearly the same exact prediction of success in a classroom-based yoga course, and roll out the mats and stretch course. And so one might ask ourselves at this point, you know, why is English equally predictive of that as it is of any of these other GE courses? And so I ran through this really quickly, but the reason I showed you this study is that I think it's useful as we think about, okay, so why do students struggle in GE courses? We've got to ask ourselves questions about what brings them to that course. And I think as we think about students moving through pathways in a wide range of areas, these are the type of research questions we ask. What happens to students who get C's as they're moving into sequence courses? I can tell you what happens. They do very poorly. What are the key courses that are on the pathway that block students? Block students' momentum. So again, I know this is all a little bit of a fire hose version, but as you step back from this, I think the three takeaways from today are, one, you know, this idea of the loss of momentum framework is really powerful. We've seen it resonate at the CBD colleges. It resonates really strongly at all colleges across the country. I've presented them a lot in the last couple of years. The idea that there's a series of things that are barriers or loss points to students, a series of things that can provide them increased momentum, and that we can analyze our primary student pathways and try to identify some of those and work with them. The KPI section was really to give you just a little insight into how we measure progress toward some of those pathways. And this last section, I think the research one, we've got, and I usually do this one in about 2 or 2.5 hours. So this is really just a taste of the idea of the types of research questions we're going to ask are going to be very different when we're focused on progress towards the degree and pathways than they were when we just focused on courses. And so that's kind of the quick overview. And you're going to have a series of other webinars coming down the pike with other ideas from CBD, such as the strong role of practitioner engagement. Our Allison Cadlick and Public Agenda is going to talk with you about not just getting people to buy into this, but really using the great resources, the human resources you have on your campus to help be the agents of change you need to make some of these things happen. We'll come back later, also talk about the design principles from CBD. And one of the things I love about completion by design is it's not a how-to, you shall do things exactly this way type of initiative. It's a, here's a framework to think about student progression. Here's some ways to look at data. Here are some design principles that we think are really useful, and kind of you can integrate them in your own way as you move forward. And so I know you have the webinar series coming down the pike. The last thing I will say is we've developed some resources, and I think many of these are available on Success NC, if I'm not mistaken. When I was at the RP group, under Completion by Design, developed an inquiry guide series on 4 main topics, and I'll just run through real quickly. This last one, Building a Culture of Inquiry, which I just introduced at the end. One of them is on the loss momentum framework. One of them is on nuances of completion, which kind of looks at the data side, and another one is on the principles of redesign. And each of these is a 20 to 25 page document where it walks through, these aren't missives or white papers, but they're really exploratory documents, wrestling with, kind of sharing with you the thinking behind these issues, and also giving you case studies, and have a whole lot of discussion questions in there that you can use back on your campus to help move the needle going forward. They are all available on the Completion by Design website, completionbydesign.org. They're available on my new website, inquirytoimprovement.com. And so now I will pause for any final questions. This has been a lot to digest. I know it's 5:15 on the Monday before Thanksgiving, but anyone who has questions, feel free to fire them either into chat or Q&A at this point. And I will pause again. People are like, we are out of here. Thank you very much. Give it another minute or so.
Well, first I want to say thank you, Rob, for that tour de force of a very timely topic.
Quite welcome.
As we wrap up, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying you guys are quite welcome. I know it's a lot in these webinars. The format's challenging to kind of interact with folks, but I think the key here is there's a lot in here. There's a lot to kind of explore and interact with, and you know, you've got this kind of structure of the initiative around it, and I think it's pretty exciting what you guys are taking on at a state level. And I want to share at the end, I'm very optimistic not only about the effective completion by design on the 9 colleges it serves, the 5 in North Carolina, the 3 in Ohio, and the 1 in Florida, but the overall movement around these issues of completion and structure from not just within CBD, but other projects around the country. I think in a couple of years, we're going to have some pretty amazing data to make the case for this, and I just hope that folks can interact with the principles and the thinking behind this to help move things forward in the interim.
Well, thank you, and we're excited about it too. Now, as we wrap up, I'd like to remind everyone that today's presentation was recorded so you can watch it again on demand at successnc.org. It should be edited and posted within about a week. All of you who signed up as participants or attendees today will get an automated message when that becomes available. And I invite you to check out successnc.org for other helpful webinars and videos. Many thanks again to our presenter, Dr. Rob Johnstone of the National Center for Inquiry and Improvement. And thanks to Susan Barbita of Guilford Technical Community College for her help in making things happen today. Now, on behalf of North Carolina Community Colleges and all of us on the Learning Solutions team, thanks to all of you for your participation. So long, everyone.